Good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning. To everyone who's arriving and settling in, my name is Kirsten Evans, and I am on staff here at In Defense of Christians. For those of you who are not familiar with In Defense of Christians, we are a fairly new organization that seeks to unite the Christian voice in the United States in order to raise awareness, education, advocacy, and humanitarian aid for the plight of Christian minorities in the Middle East. We are very honored and privileged today to be able to welcome a good friend of ours, His Grace Bishop Angelus of the Coptic Church in the United Kingdom, who is in town for a couple of days, and we're very grateful that he's taken his time out of his busy schedule to be able to be with us today. We would also like to welcome Dr. Katrina Lantos Sweat, who is, for those of you who are not familiar with her, she's the current chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. She's established the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice and serves currently as its president and its chief executive officer. We also are very pleased to have a special guest with us, who is her mother, Annette Lantos, who is the chairman of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice and the wife of late Congressman Tom Lantos. So welcome. Thank you for being with us. A big welcome as well to Professor Robert Destro, who is also a good friend and a professor of law and the founding director of the Interdisciplinary Program of Law and Religion at the Catholic University of America's Columbus School of Law in Washington. Unfortunately, Tom Farr, who was planning to join us today, has been detained in transportation from a destination afar, and so Professor Destro has very graciously offered to step into Tom's stead as moderator for this morning's event. So thank you, Professor Destro. Welcome also to Catherine Jean Lopez. Many of you know, of course, who Catherine is. She's an award-winning opinion journalist and an editor for the National Review Online. Catherine's voice on issues of religion and global politics and religious freedom are heard in many, many publications beyond just the one for whom she writes in her daily job, right? Her regular everyday job. And Nermeen Raid, Nermeen as well, a very good friend, and is a founding member and currently the president and chairman of Coptic Orphans, an organization that does humanitarian work for children throughout Egypt and is internationally recognized and internationally organized. So thank you very much, Nermeen, for being with us here today. As we know, a generation ago, the question of religion and global politics was kind of a non-question. A generation ago, it was sort of understood that religion had become rather obsolete with regard to its influence and its importance in geopolitics. And yet, perhaps one of the big surprises of the 21st century has been the increasing importance and the increasing rise of the question of religion and its impact on the political sphere, the cultural sphere, the world of peacekeeping, the world of aid, the world of conflict, and the world of global politics. So it is a question, the impact of religion, in that both policymakers and media personnel as well have to struggle with and answer in their daily lives and in their daily professions. So we are very, very grateful for our panel of experts who have come today to speak to us about sensitivity rather than sensationalism, the role of Western media coverage on human rights and religious issues in the Middle East. And I think we will just begin, in the interest of time, by letting His Grace, Bishop Angelus, start with some opening remarks.
Good morning. I am very pleased to be here with you. It seems that the world is standing up and taking notice of much of what is happening in the Middle East. And there are more and more opportunities for us to speak, and speak loudly, and speak in a way that is now being understood. There is no doubt that there is a huge role for journalists and for media. There is no doubt that this role will continue to grow. But there is also a need for an understanding of what is achieved through reporting facts. It is without a doubt that the vast majority of the people of the world will experience the vast majority of the world's occurrences through the eyes and interpretation and explanation of a very small minority of those who report these events to those people. And that is why it is important to have that perspective. An American writer by the name of Leslie Cockburn said, "Journalism for me has always been a calling. There are things that must be exposed to the light, truths that must be uncovered, stories worth risking your life for." It's very easy to be condemning and to be critical. But as someone who sees a lot of positive things in life and looks for the positive, I also understand that the drive of most, if not all, of people who go into journalism is a drive that is honorable, to bring things to the front and to report things in a way that they see is important. The reach of media now is changing. The dynamics are changing. The emergence of social media has meant that conventional media is in a very different place. It is more wide-reaching, so that we have the conventional doing what it has done for decades, but now, for all intents and purposes, every person is a journalist. Everyone with a phone, a Twitter account, a Facebook profile, or who can just pick up a Skype line and speak to a reporter anywhere in the world, is a reporter. And what that has done is it has pushed conventional media and conventional reporting to try to catch up and to keep up. There is no doubt that media, journalism, reporting will impact and direct public opinion, and it will generate a response. And that is both positive and negative. That will work both for and against people on every side of the argument. But what we must realize is media coverage goes deeper than what happens on your monitor. Media coverage impacts lives. We are now in such a state in the world that sometimes concerns me. Everyone wants to watch some kind of Big Brother program, or watching some celebrity digging his way out of some jungle somewhere in the world. We want to watch what's happening in kitchens when people are brought together to cook, or when families, some prominent families in this country, decide to get up to their shenanigans. The idea is we've become voyeuristic. We want to watch people's lives rather than live our own. And the media we have helps us towards that. And the media we have encourages us to focus on the lives of others rather than on what we can do. There has been a greater focus and interest now, alarmingly, on how things are reported rather than what is reported. So speed is essential. Immediacy is essential. How you can get your news on your phone, through what app, which Twitter accounts you follow, how quickly this news updates, how often the website refreshes. And of course, this puts an immense amount of pressure on journalists and those who provide media. It is no longer about looking at the details of the story, verifying, making sure that what is said is actually what has happened, representing an opinion in the right way, rather than how someone has perceived it or reported it. I try not to, but I found that I myself have fallen foul, once that I remember, of tweeting something too quickly and then actually going back and deleting it. Because I just realized, well, I didn't verify that fact. And so I can't actually tweet it out from my account. Because someone will look at that, say the bishop has said, and therefore it must be credible, or at least I'd like to think they would. And so therefore it must be true, and so therefore I will tweet it as well, and I will circulate it as well. Because of a lack of resource, because of tightening budgets, because of changing structures, because of flattening management models, there is much more pressure on media networks. And so you have people sent to different parts of the world or used from different parts of the world to become your source of news. That, unfortunately, does not always come with a wealth of experience, or local knowledge, or local understanding. It becomes an obstacle to accurate reporting, because it becomes your truth. If your person on the ground has reported this to you, then it becomes your truth. And your truth becomes the truth of others as well. When they read this, when they internalize it, when they believe it, when they use it, when they propagate it. But that could all stem from something that is less than detailed and less than accurate. The thing about sensationalist recording is, or reporting, is that it gets a reaction. And we want a reaction. That's why when I was discussing with those preparing today, the two words that came to my mind were sensitivity and sensationalism. Because they cannot go into the same approach for reporting. The dangers of sensationalist reporting are that they aim for a reaction, and if they don't get it, then they will change the story. And that creates distrust. And it creates a sense of isolation. If a community on the ground feels that it has been misrepresented, misreported, then it feels that it can no longer not only respect or trust this source, but all Western media becomes bad. All Western reporters become dishonest. All Western media sources become self-interested and must have a hidden agenda. And of course, anyone who has dealt with the Middle East will know that conspiracy is quite often what drives theory. People then feel marginalized, feel misrepresented. And that stems from a lack of knowledge of the Middle East dynamic. There is no one-size-fits-all for Middle East Christians or Middle East minorities or the Middle East. The situation of Christians in Egypt and Lebanon is very different to those of Christians in Libya, Syria, and Iraq. The attitude of Christians there, their feeling that they can continue, they want to continue, is different. And so to present one picture of what's happening to Christians and the Yazidis and Shabaks and every other minority in the Middle East, just to make it easier for press, just to make it easier for publication, just to make it easier for those who digest the news, doesn't always give the greatest indication of the news or the facts. Two negative scenarios quickly. In 2011, a group of peaceful demonstrators went on the streets of Egypt to demonstrate against the attack on burning the church. And going past the government news building in an area called Maspero, were attacked. They were mowed down by armored personnel carriers, they were run over, they were killed. And yet the Egyptian media at the time, Egyptian state media, had reporters going on air saying, go protect your army because the Christians are attacking your army. Now, since then, we've known the relationship between the Egyptian people and their army. So when you're there and you're telling people that Christians are attacking their army to go and protect them, that incites. Likewise, when we had the attacks on the churches in August 2013, unprecedented, 50 churches, 50 places of Christian ministry attacked within a very small space of 48 hours. Again, it took the world 2 weeks to report on that. After that, it was more legitimate, but 2 weeks for the world to wake up to the fact that if these had been 100 other places of worship of any religious group in any part of the world, under any conditions, would we have kept silent? The positive case study, however, is that of Libya. Recently, 21 Christians who had gone to Libya to support their families, as you all know, were captured and beheaded brutally. This was a turning point for the news. This was a turning point for the world. This showed that even evil had a red line that people didn't want it to cross. And then there was a reaction. These 21 unknown men from a small village had suddenly impacted tens of millions of people around the world because of the way they lost their lives and the witness they had presented. Because of the clarity of this reporting, the sincerity of it, the credibility of it, the Coptic community felt empowered. It felt that it was supported. Media, however, can positively impact, but it must work towards reporting facts and not generating a narrative. It must work towards reporting facts on the ground rather than guiding and directing public sentiment and public opinion. A dear friend of mine, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, said that good journalism is one of the models of good conversation and communication in the wider social context. And that's what it should be, a good model of good communication, of good conversation, with an attempt to understand what's happening on the ground, with a requirement that the culture is understood, that there is an integrity in reporting, an understanding of the religious framework in which the region lives and exists. It will then create a system of trust of people. When it listens to what people are saying, rather than just how they're saying it. Again, listening in the Middle East, you see people who become angry, who say things because of a difference of language, a difference of expression, difference of culture. It's very easy to pick up on that. Much more difficult, yet much more fair, to actually dig into it and see what is meant by what was said, rather than just what was said. And that comes from experience and comes from knowledge. It comes from an integrity and a desire to present a proper picture. It means that the outpouring of emotion doesn't generate the headlines and become inflammatory and becomes misrepresenting of those who may just be grieving. The media must always reflect humanity in the situation in which it finds itself. It must remember that human beings are not just numbers and statistics, and unfortunately we've all been numbed. We turn on our televisions when we hear that only 10 people died today in Iraq. That must have been a good day. And it's tragic, and it's horrible. But each one of those 10 lives is a life that has touched 10 families and communities and countries. We need to steer away from labeling communities and groups, generalizing. We must report atrocities as atrocities and not be selective because of who they may fall upon or which interests they may serve. We must not merely seek the lowest common denominator or the simplest model to present, because sometimes, often, what happens is far from simple, and it needs a more critical and informed eye. We must work to ethically and genuinely report news, not create scenarios that we want to propagate. And above all, journalism must focus on truth, verification, the public good, rather than speed, productivity, and mere output. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Grace. And our next speaker will be Dr. Katrina Lantos Sweat. So please join us.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here today with you. As I was listening to the Bishop's very, very thoughtful remarks, I couldn't help but think, Bishop, that ISIS has clearly perceived this gluttonous appetite for sensationalism that you described so accurately and has designed its particularly vicious atrocities to quench that appetite that's out there in the world. And so this sort of reasoned and fair-minded and calming approach that you are calling us all to embrace is made all the more difficult by the cruelty of the bare facts that we face in the threats around us. I am very honored to be joining Your Grace, as well as IDC and the panel members, for today's discussion on the Middle East and minorities here at the National Press Club. I know I speak for many people when I say that your tremendous advocacy for tolerance and goodwill, human rights and religious freedom throughout the Middle East and indeed the world has earned the admiration of so many, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you. At a time when the very future of Middle East minorities, including Coptic Orthodox Christians, the region's largest body of Christians, is imperiled, I am convinced that there is no better person than Your Grace to be drawing attention to this crisis and speaking his mind on its implications. I would like to address my remarks more broadly, if I may, to this issue of religious freedom and how it is sort of the antidote to the poison that seems to be infecting so much of that region of the world. And I look forward, perhaps during the back and forth after our presentations, to responding more specifically on the issues related to the media. Like everyone else in this room, I have watched with feelings of shock and revulsion, horror and outrage, as ISIL has terrorized two of the Middle East's most vulnerable minorities, Christians and Yazidis. I have seen the same reports that you have. Women and girls kidnapped and enslaved, men and boys beheaded or crucified, families driven from their homes and facing starvation and death, and 2,000-year-old communities of life and faith uprooted and threatened with extinction. And knowing the enormity of the suffering, I am convinced of two things. First, while I know our country, the United States, and like-minded states have been rendering assistance, we must do more. Lives are at stake, conscience calls and demands our utmost. But second, emergency help, while essential to protect lives and communities from the current danger, is not enough. In the long run, there is only one permanent guarantor of the safety, security, and survival of religious minorities. It is the full recognition of religious freedom as a sacred human right which every nation, government, and individual must fully support, and no nation, no government, and no individual must ever violate with impunity. Clearly, one of government's most important responsibilities is to recognize, protect, and nurture religious freedom. But as we know, most Middle East governments have repeatedly failed to do so, especially when faced with the rise of religious extremism. In Saudi Arabia, for example, extremist forces profoundly influence the government. The kingdom bans churches and any public religious expression that contradicts its own interpretation of Sunni Islam, while meting out barbaric punishments to transgressors, as we have seen with the brutal flogging of Raif Badawi and the cruel imprisonment of his lawyer, human rights defender, Walid Abu al-Khair. In Iran, extremist forces literally are the government. From Christians like Pastor Abedini to other religious minorities such as Baha'is and Sunni Muslims, and to dissident Shia, the regime subjects those who contradict its own brand of Shia Islam to arrests and torture, incarceration, and even death. In Egypt, the government continues to enforce anti-blasphemy codes, with Coptic Christians and other minorities, including atheists, bearing the brunt of the enforcement, while failing to protect minorities from violence or to bring the perpetrators to justice. And of course, there is the situation in Iraq and Syria, in which governments and non-state actors alike target religious minorities. In Iraq, the government fails to protect Christians and Yazidis, as well as Shia Muslims and dissenting Sunnis, with ISIL's depredations the latest in a series of extremist assaults against these communities. In response to this failure, many Iraqi Christians sought refuge in Syria. But President Bashar Assad treated Syrians as members of sectarian groups vying for his favor, rather than individual citizens possessing equal rights under the law. When massive numbers peacefully took to the streets and demanded their rights as citizens, Assad's regime fired on them while turning sectarian groups against one another. The civil war that followed has left Christians and others deeply vulnerable, with the regime's forces not only failing to protect them, but along with extremist groups on both sides actually attacking their communities. The story of both Iraq and Syria offers a cautionary tale to Christians and other religious minorities. In both countries, these minorities were safe for a while, but that was mostly due to the capricious whim of dictators, Saddam Hussein in Iraq and Assad in Syria, who chose to protect them for their own purposes. But to rely on the favor of a single strongman or regime is to live precariously indeed. For the better part of 20 centuries, the most persecuted religious minority in Europe was forced to live that way as well. Europe's Jews once faced the same predicament that Middle East Christians have faced in our time, relying on a strong man's good graces in country after country. The question, of course, is what happens when the strong man passes from the scene or loses control? Another question is what happens if he changes his mind one day and decides it's no longer in his interest to protect an embattled minority? In the blink of an eye, a minority's safety and security could vanish. Clearly, there has to be a better way to ensure protection for religious minorities. Thankfully, there is a better way. It is the way of religious freedom. Rulers come and rulers go, but when a society commits itself to religious freedom, it guarantees the security of religious communities no matter who holds power. Granted, to embed religious freedom and other human rights in a society is no easy task, but consider the alternatives. Simply stated, there are no alternatives. And so, when forces of violent religious extremism and other threats to minorities rear their head, the ultimate answer is not an Assad or a Saddam. It is never just one man. It is never just one administration. It is never a dictator who can change his mind and break his promises in a heartbeat. The ultimate answer lies with an idea, and that idea is religious freedom. For humanitarian reasons, for the sake of Christians and other Middle East minorities, we must stand tall for this freedom as an antidote to religious extremism. But there is another reason, too. In standing for this bedrock liberty, we stand for our own security as well. From the 9/11 attacks on America to this January's assaults in France, it is clear that, as with any other region, what goes on in the Middle East won't stay in the Middle East. Unless it is countered and defeated by religious freedom and pluralism, the poison of religious extremism will cross oceans and continents. When Christians in Egypt or beyond the Middle East, in Pakistan, are jailed for blasphemy or attacked by extremists for supposedly violating such laws, and we are silent, we should not be surprised when attacks commence in the streets of Paris or elsewhere. When Coptic Christians are beheaded by ISIL in North Africa, people risk succumbing to the same terrible fate elsewhere. Clearly, the Middle East's business, and indeed the world's business, is our business when it comes to the way religious minorities are treated. That is why we are here today. Let us be clear. The time for silence is over. The time to speak out is now. The time to bear witness is today. There is no other option, and there is no other way. We must heed the call of conscience and stand together for freedom. I would like to close my remarks with a story from many centuries ago that I think has some bearing on this notion of what it means to build societies that honor the rights of conscience. John Wycliffe, the English philosopher, theologian, reformer, and preacher, undertook to translate the Bible from the Latin Vulgate into the common vernacular in the late 1300s. And he did so in the face of enormous opposition and even persecution from the ecclesiastical authorities of his day. But despite all, he persisted. And when his work was done, he wrote the following words in the flyleaf of that first Bible. "The translation is complete and shall make possible government of the people, by the people, and for the people." Many of you might have thought that that famous phrase derived from a famous address at Gettysburg, but it has a much older patrimony. Now, we cannot know precisely what Wycliffe meant when he wrote those words, but I believe he was illuminating for all of us the profound insight that when men and women are free to pursue and understand truth for themselves, they become empowered to build societies that honor the claims of conscience and fundamental liberties and rights of all people. May it be our goal to build such societies. Thank you.
Thank you so much for everyone who came here today. I know you have busy schedules. In particular, His Grace, thank you so much for being here. You help us in the media tell our story better, tell your story better, and help us understand better. So thank you for being here. I was very taken with what you said about our voyeuristic culture. Of course, we can all understand that. That resonates with a lot of us, and. First of all, the martyrdom of the 21 Egyptian Christians was such a turning point, I think, in a number of ways. And you saw it when you saw all these media outlets actually going deeper, as you said, and encountering these people and their families and their villages, and actually trying to understand. And another turning point moment, I think, in recent history was in July of 2013. Pope Francis went to an island called Lampedusa in Sicily. A lot of people had been dying, many of the Muslims dying, fleeing from Egypt and coming across the water. So some had died there, some had died on the way there, some were living there as refugees. And the people were taking them in and rising to the occasion. But no one in the world knew this was going on. And when I say the world, I mean the Western media, because that's how we often think of the world. And he said at the time, and he went there for two reasons: to make people pay attention, because he's wildly popular and he knows he has this power, and as a pastor, to go and pray and to celebrate Mass for these men and women who most of the world had no knowledge of, didn't care about, to recognize these were people whose lives were lost, looking for freedom, looking to preserve their lives. And he said, we look upon the brother half dead by the roadside. Perhaps we think, poor guy, and we continue on our way, which is always such a danger, even in the story, the turning point story of the 21 martyrs. Well, these poor people, and then we sort of move on. And we say it's none of our business what's going on. And we feel fine with this, he continued. We feel at peace with this. We feel fine. The culture of well-being that makes us think of ourselves, that makes us insensitive to the cries of others, that makes us live in soap bubbles, that are beautiful but are nothing, are illusions of futility, of the transient, that brings indifference to others, that brings even the globalization of indifference. In this world of globalization, we have fallen into a globalization of indifference. We are accustomed to the suffering of others. It doesn't concern us. It's none of our business. He went on to say, where is your brother? Adam, where is your brother? These are the two questions that God puts at the beginning of the story of humanity, and that he also addresses to the men and women of our time, even to us. And then he said, but I want to set before us a third question. Who among us has wept for these things and things like that? Who has wept for the death of brothers and sisters? And he goes on, and I recommend that you go and read it. You can read it online. He talks about weeping so much, and I don't think we have any idea, if we're paying attention to it, we don't really have any idea what he's talking about. And I think his model of what he did in Lampedusa, just going there and being with the people and weeping for them and praying to God for them and in gratitude for their lives, is a model of what Christians in the media need to be doing. And I address my remarks particularly to Christians in the media because, like In Defense of Christians, they're not saying that if you're not Christian, it doesn't matter. The Pope cares about Muslims who are dying. We care about Yazidis who are dying. But Christians have a particular responsibility as members of the body of Christ to be telling these stories. And I think that the model that Pope Francis has given us is one of prayer, obviously, and how do you avoid just being indifferent about these stories and moving on and being quick and surface level? Well, by praying, by actually praying, seeing your job as a vocation. I think the other theme that is throughout Pope Francis's remarks and modeling is encounter. Talk to people, hear their stories, ask them what they need. Again, as His Grace was warning us about telling our stories with our agenda in mind. No, actually, there's a more interesting story probably than the one you want to drive. So really encounter people who are persecuted, Christians who are persecuted, and live in solidarity with them. And that again, and I'll stop here, is I think the rallying cry moment here for Christians. Those 21 martyrs died. And we not only have to tell their story because they died and because they're Christians, but it is our responsibility, as brothers and sisters in Christ, So prayer, encounter, and solidarity I might go a long way to sort of help the media landscape a little bit and offer ourselves as models for how ethical reporting happens. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Catherine. And our next speaker is Nermeen Riyad, and she will enlighten us from her perspective.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you to In Defense of Christians for pulling this event together. I feel that my co-panelists have already shed important light on how Western media coverage and human rights can cover human rights issues and religious issues, and it needs to be done, as His Grace had said, with sensitivity rather than sensationalism. And the perspective that I'd like to bring today is out of experience with working on the ground in the Middle East in humanitarian work, development work, and education. And my goal is, for providing that perspective, is to help our friends in the media understand how together we can do more to build a peaceful and a prosperous region there in the Middle East. As my colleagues have touched on, minority religious groups are an important part of the Middle East and its social fabric. So to take Christians as an example, we are continuing the work of Christ of healing and educating, and this is done through schools, hospitals, and non-governmental organizations. These institutions actually play a key role in maintaining social harmony, and this is the role that is often underreported in the Western media. I'd like to give you an example coming from Egypt, and there are Christian nuns called the Sisters of Maadi. They serve over 200,000 needy people in Cairo yearly. 90% of them are Muslims. And as you can imagine, this has a huge effect on interfaith relations at the grassroots. This is the very area where often actors have a very difficult time having an impact at the grassroots. Coptic Orphans is one of those non-governmental organizations serving over 10,000 children and their families in their communities. And we work through church volunteers in their own communities. So we're among the people on the ground. And we work in many religiously mixed neighborhoods. So when there's tension, the solution in these neighborhoods are not always as black and white as they might appear to outsiders. So in many cases, it's critically important to us that the media refrain from screaming headlines and reporting that doesn't give the full context of the story. Simply because when reporters don't present the facts of an issue in a sober and straightforward way, it can create the climate of violence. It puts our staff and the people that we serve at risk. This is especially true as the world becomes more interconnected. The internet now makes it harder and harder for us to distinguish between Western media and non-Western media. The most violent images and videos cross the world at light speed. Texts are mistranslated and misquoted. Social platforms now offer torrents of misinformation. In this context, the most important thing the media can do is to help people distinguish between sensationalism and reality. They can do this by reporting on minority faith communities, especially efforts to build bridges with neighbors before a crisis erupts. Every day, there are thousands of great stories to tell about the work of schools and hospitals and aid groups in the Middle East. Telling those stories before the crisis will help people on all sides screen out the sensational and focus on the beneficial. Coptic Orphans' experience on the ground is that the more people learn about their neighbors, the less fearful they are and less prone to extremism. The media can crush that positive tendency with sensationalism or nurture it by covering the good work being done in the communities. After all, what's more beneficial to the people in the Middle East? Sensational reminders of religious differences or sensible reminders of good faith efforts to fight poverty, hunger, and disease? In closing, I would observe that it's tempting to focus the TV cameras on the extremists. Those extremists exist in every community, and they will always be willing to say something outrageous in front of the camera. But the media's role should be to cover people of all faith in every country who are working for better relations with their neighbors. That kind of sensitivity, not sensationalism, will truly benefit all the people in the Middle East. Thank you.
Okay. All right, well, thank you. Thank you, Nermeen, that was great. And it dovetails very nicely into my comments. I have the honor of coming last before the discussion, and I'm going to try and keep it very short so that you can ask questions of the people who actually know what they're talking about here. So let me talk about the role of the press. I think His Grace has given you a very good and I think robust understanding of what the press is and how it has changed over time. But today I'm going to talk about the press generally, and I want to make 3 points. All of which requires journalists to understand who the audience is, and then go from there. My concern as a human rights lawyer and someone who specializes in religious freedom is that the press has an obligation to tell the whole story. And you've heard that before. But let me be very specific, that His Grace has taken a very public leadership position decrying the slaughter of innocents. And this is truly something that we have not seen in the way we have seen it since World War II. I mean, people being targeted for their faith, and we need to call things by their proper names here. But the innocents are not just Christians. They're Shia Muslims, they're Yazidis, they're Sunnis, they're Ahmadis. They're people who dare question Salafi extremists. The Salafis who are doing the killing and destruction of culture are driven by an ideology. Where's the serious coverage of what the ideology is, who supports them, and what our government's doing beyond boots on the ground or death from the air by bombs and drone-borne missiles? This is an ideological struggle we're talking about. Daesh, what we call ISIS, is seeking to reshape the identity of an entire region by destroying its history, its cultural identity, and the communities themselves. So if you think that the winged bulls or the winged horses in Mosul are the end, the Sphinx is coming. The United States cannot. The next reason why I'd say that journalists need to be very, very serious about their coverage and the depth of that coverage is that the United States and the West, the Western world, and even the friendly countries of the Muslim world, in the Middle East, in the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia, cannot develop a coherent strategy without the press telling the whole story in all of its dynamic complexity. First of all, unless we're clear about the nature of who the enemy is, we cannot possibly come up with a strategy to fight him. Our enemy is a criminal network, not Islam. It's more like the narco-terrorist networks that we deal with in South America than it is a religious movement. This is why the president of France, François Hollande, refuses to use the term ISIS or ISIL, because this network of criminals is neither Islamic nor a state. and we have to be very careful to get our terms right. And then third, the task is to take down that network, from the head cutters to the bankers who launder their money, and the sheikhs who provide it, and the imams who incite the violence. Keep the focus on the network. And then lastly, and this is where I want to echo what other people on the panel have said, that the press needs to help the Christian, Muslim, Jewish, and other American communities of faith and the atheists to understand that the vital role that they have to play as believers and non-believers in this struggle. You know, virtually everybody that I speak to, from law students, you know, people on the street, people who know the kinds of things that I've been doing on the ground in the Middle East, everybody wants to help. But they know very little about these communities. Most people, most American Christians have no idea what a Coptic Christian is and what they believe. In fact, His Grace said yesterday at a meeting at which I was privileged to attend, some people even wonder whether Eastern Christians, the Syrians, Chaldeans, and Copts, among others, are even Christians. I mean, the amount of ignorance is amazing. Is it anybody's fault? No. The question is, we got a problem, and so the first issue is, how does the press help us to understand the nature of these communities, their history, their culture, what they believe? That's really important. I was bowled over when I went to Iraqi Kurdistan for the first time. You know, when people said, St. Thomas slept in that cave. And you begin to realize just how ancient the church is in that region. So if I can make a plea, it's let's get the whole story out. Let's trust the whole First Amendment is based on the idea that people of good faith will make good judgments if they're well informed. And so with that, I will turn the question, the time over to questions, and please raise your hand, and we'll have a microphone for you back here. So who wants to go first?
Yes, my name is Ivan Pliss. I'm a reporter with the Daily Caller News Foundation. I have two quick questions. First of all, how does it benefit the framing to talk about the current coalition against IS, Daesh, whatever you want to call it, as a religious or ideological conflict versus a purely military one, and the question sort of recognizing the religious component and the ideological component of what they do. And second of all, you know, in the last couple of years, especially sort of year and a half, we've seen an increasing sort of reference, perhaps a little bit cynically, to the existence of something called persecution industrial complex, sort of folks, as was alluded to earlier, with certain particular political agendas or social agendas, interested in using very real tragedies to advance their own causes. Do we think it's fair to talk about the existence of that sort of a thing? And if so, how do we go about doing that?
Okay. I think I'm going to turn that question over initially to Your Grace.
Thank you. Very quickly, I've already been interviewed twice today. Once by UK-based, by the BBC, and once by a US radio channel. And they've both pushed me on the question of military intervention and the nature of it. I totally agree with you. It's not purely religious and it's not purely military. We're speaking about an ideology here. And while I am very, very thankful that I don't have to make decisions on whether there is a military intervention or not, of course, as a minister and as my own particular stance as a Christian, is that there is sacredness in every life, whether it's the Coptic Christian or the Daesh terrorist. It's still a life created by God in His image and His likeness, misused, yet still sacred. And so whatever averts death and the ending of life and the tragic ending of life is better. What would be much better suited doing is to attack ideology. And that ideology cannot be addressed externally. It must be addressed internally within an internal conversation by prominent and respected Muslim leaders who need to address one of two issues. They will either say, these problematic texts upon which these groups are basing their actions on don't exist and they're wrong, or that there needs to be a nuanced approach to these texts within the current setting, within the current situation. But that's not something I can say as a Christian or even a journalist can say. That needs to be an internal conversation. And I think that's where the real treatment of this situation is going to be. On your second question, I totally agree. There is now, it's becoming an industry, and it offends me and it sickens me that it is. I read an article by one person who was offended that the 21 Christians killed were not referred to as Coptic Orthodox Christians, although this person probably wouldn't accept that I was a Christian anyway, but wanted to be affiliated with the issue rather than accept the other. So it is offensive, but thankfully, the vast majority of voices are not like that. They are interested, they are sincere, they are horrified, and they're working towards a better solution.
Dr. Sweat?
Yes, I would add just a couple of thoughts. You know, for many years there was this secularization thesis that as countries and societies became more educated, more affluent, more sophisticated, the role of religion would become increasingly less significant and more marginal. And I think that we are struggling, certainly here in the West, to wrap our heads around the fact that this ideological enemy that we face has a huge religious component in their ideology, because that is something that we thought would no longer be sort of on the table in the struggles, ideological, military, economic, and otherwise, between civilizations and nations. So I think we make a mistake if we ignore the reality that a very significant component is of this criminal ideology that we are facing and this criminal syndicate that we are facing is a sort of an extremist and fanatic view of the Muslim faith. We have to wrap our heads around that. There was a very influential article that came out maybe 2 weeks ago called What ISIS Wants. I think it was troubling and shocking to a lot of people because the author, who had spent a lot of time researching it, sort of said, look, there's a coherent theory behind what these people are doing. It's sickening, it's reprehensible, but they are sincere, they are knowledgeable, they have a foundation for almost everything they do, including the specific punishments that they are inflicting upon their victims. And so we, living in the very secularized West, and you know, America is more openly religious than most of our friends in Europe, but even in this country, it's a highly secular environment. We are struggling to bridge that enormous gulf in world views. And I do think that if we are going to be effective, I think His Grace said in the outset of his remarks, you have to understand the circumstance you're dealing with in order to effectively strategize how to deal with it. And in this instance, I think you also said you must understand your enemy. And so we can never permit ourselves to fall into the trap of really slandering the religion of Islam by permitting this perverse version of it to sort of claim that faith. We must be very careful to that threat. But we also have to be clear-eyed and say, there's a religious component to this ideology, and in part because there is a religious component, some of the levers that one would use with an ordinary criminal syndicate won't work. They don't value their lives as much as they value some of the things they believe they should sacrifice their lives for. They are not restrained by some of the ordinary rules of what we might call civilized behavior, because a significant portion of them believe they are called for a higher purpose to do unspeakable things. And so I do think that part of the solution is understanding that dimension to this problem.
Okay, Catherine?
In addition to not looking at these things ideologically, looking at Christian persecution ideologically, I think we in the West have to be careful too, thinking about these poor people and what we can do to help. Yes, obviously we can help, but there's another component there where those 21 martyrs in Egypt, Coptic Christians, showed us something about integrity and about who we are. And we have these debates about religious freedom all the time, but I often feel like no one has any idea what we're talking about, or we're having an academic debate, or we're just having our same old political discussions. When you look at the lives of people who will actually die for their faith, they're giving us a gift that I don't think we fully appreciate when we talk about how we can help them by telling their stories. I think we have to bear that in mind too as we have these political discussions.
Okay, next.
Yes, Peter Jester Smith with the National Catholic Register. I had recently been over in Lebanon and Jordan, and I had met some of these Syrian refugees, and I will tell you, I was most struck with how the dignity that they had, even amidst their sufferings. It was quite striking. And what this lends me to is this next thought. We've been talking a lot about the negative with Daesh, ISIS, and the violence there. But what about the positive? Are there cultural resources that can come from the Middle East that we can pay attention to? What gives me this thought is we have King Abdullah II of Jordan, who is a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad himself. In a certain way, he's a kind of a counter figure to Daesh and the alleged caliph. And at the same time, it was also his great-grandfather, if I recall, Faisal I, who proposed with his kingdom of Syria, that was short-lived, that there'd be religious freedom. Are there cultural and historical and certain leadership figures that we should pay attention to in which a sort of a religious freedom and a renaissance for the Middle East might come?
You're great.
After the attack on the churches in Egypt in August of 2013, His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales made contact and actually came and visited our Coptic Centre, and we had a good visit with a roundtable discussion. And His Royal Highness had the wonderful foresight to bring with him Prince Ghazi from Jordan to accompany him on that visit. And we later had a reception at Clarence House, the Prince's residence in London, in which they both spoke. So there is a huge role for voices from the Middle East to speak. Again, I think we oversimplifies the picture. I always warn against terminology like the Christian West and the Muslim world, because Coptic Christians and Chaldean Christians and Maronite Christians and every other Christian live in the so-called Muslim world. And does that mean that they no longer have a place? Does that mean they are foreigners in a place where they are indigenous people? So Muslims within the Middle East who speak in very much the same terms that we would, denouncing the acts of Daesh, are very valuable. And as I said earlier, while it is the role of the intra-Muslim conversation to challenge these thoughts, that is because the vast majority of Muslims, and I say that with absolute confidence, would totally reject and denounce these things. But when you get leaders who have integrity, who have authenticity, and who have a knowledge, speaking, it makes a difference. Egyptian President Sisi went to Al-Azhar University and spoke there to Al-Azhar about reforming the curriculum, because the curriculum there has within it the texts that are being used by groups like Daesh to legitimize what they're doing. He was the perfect person to say this, not just because he's a Muslim, but he is seen as a devout Muslim. And so he could say that with legitimacy and with authority. And so I completely agree that that voice is not only desirable, it is essential and critical at this time.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, I'd like to add just a little bit to that, and that is that we don't have to like the speaker. That the importance is what they have to say. And I'll give you a very good example of that. There was a recent article by Dennis Prager in the National Review, where he attacked NBC for interviewing Dr. Zarif, who's the foreign minister of Iran. If you listen to that interview, he speaks to this extremism, and what he has to say is phenomenal. Because the Iranians have been fighting and have been screaming about this kind of Muslim extremism for years and years and years. And so what we have to do is keep our focus on the problem created by Daesh. And because as soon as we let it get caught up in the nuclear weapons controversy or the Shia-Sunni divide between Saudi Arabia and Iran and other parts of the Gulf, we're missing the issue that we were gathered here to talk about. So we have to be very, very clear that it's okay for people that we disagree with on other issues to speak their mind on this one. And that's what freedom of the press is about, and even people we don't like have freedom of speech, even if they work for another government. Okay? Other questions? I think you had one, right?
Good afternoon. My name is Mark Wasif, and I'm an attorney by trade, and it's an honor to be here and to listen on something this important and something that's very true to my heart. Professor, my question is geared more towards something that you said, and that was the use of the word criminal, or that the acts that are being committed by IS are criminals. So the majority of state leaders refuse to acknowledge them as a state, but we do see them as criminals. Being that as the case, does it then become a problem that's internal within the state where these crimes are being committed? Or does this, by acknowledging them as an actual state, does it now create an international obligation, whether it be by the UN Security Council under Article 6 rather, or Article 7, or by the international community customarily to act and get involved? And I know that there's a coalition in place, but the actions themselves haven't been enough. That's one question. The second question goes down to the actual fight against this particular ideology, and I pose this to everybody. I know that there are indigenous efforts to address some of the underlying roots or causes behind such an ideology, but what else does that fight involve other than military intervention?
Okay.
Thank you.
Chris, you want to say something about that one? Or? Okay. Well, and being the lawyer on the panel, I'll take that. I mean, first of all, I think that the first question you raised about basically who has the right to prosecute these criminals. I mean, what we have to understand, and this requires us to go back in history a little bit, is that Daesh has rewritten the borders of the Middle East that were put together after World War I in the same kind of British, French, American way in which we, developed a lot of borders in Africa that don't make any sense either. So what they've done is they've completely wiped out those borders. And if you look in the Atlantic article, what does ISIS really want? They say, look, they control an area bigger than the United Kingdom now. So the area they control is just phenomenal. Because they have rewritten the borders, I mean, there's no functioning government that could prosecute them. So the only thing you have is some kind of an international agreement. And as somebody who teaches international law, I'll tell you, it's those tribunals, like the International Criminal Court, you know, I know that the Islamic countries have a proposal that's been sitting on the shelf for a while about an international criminal court that would be governed by Islamic law. You know, my reaction is whatever, we have to do something together. And that means Christians, Jews, Muslims, and non-believers, and everybody else. And I can tell you that the most vociferous people who wanted to go after this, I sat at a conference last August. You know, next to me was the imam of the largest mosque in Sadr City. And he was the one who said, he was in tears as they were talking, they were showing a video of Daesh machine gunning young Shiite airmen who were caught at the military academy in Mosul. And he said, I want every single one of them, all the way down to the research assistants who help write the sermons. And he says, will you help us? You had Shia and Sunni and Turkoman and Yazidi and Christians all in the same room saying exactly the same thing. And that dovetails into your second question, you know, which is, where's the strategy? I don't see one. Okay, we don't have one. You know, and that's why I made the comment earlier about why we have to understand ISIS for the criminals that they are, you know, and how you go after them, and we have, if you look at, there's an excellent book called Treasury's War, you know, by Juan Zarate, who was the architect of all the sanctions on Iran. You know, and they went after them. They did what they always tell us to do. They followed the money. You know, we need to have that kind of a strategy. It's not just it can't just be boots on the ground. It's got to be, you know, winning the hearts and minds of those kids who see this is a pure version of Islam. Well, it's not. But I can't make that argument. I'm a Christian. You know, I've got to get my Muslim brothers and sisters to make that argument, because I wouldn't even know how to speak the language. So I think that that's why I made the point, we need a strategy. And boots on the ground isn't it. I mean, that's a piece of it, but it's only a piece. Go ahead.
I also think it is quite important in responding to the portion of your question that said, is this a matter for domestic concern in the countries where Daesh is operating, or is it a matter for international concern? My view is that it is absolutely a matter for international concern. And in the language and in the ideology and in the spoken mission of ISIL themselves. I think if history teaches us anything, it teaches us, listen to what brutal dictators, governments, movements say. Because they very often, almost always, will tell you what their mission is. They will tell you what their plan is. When those 21 young Coptic men were lined up on that beach and beheaded, and then they pointed the daggers and said, Rome next, we're coming to Rome, that was not a theatrical flourish. It may have been that as well. They are saying we have a mission, and that mission extends far beyond the territory that they now control. And so, you know, in the same way that Hitler did lay out his plans, very clearly, very unmistakably, there is a natural instinct to say, this can't be true. This is absurd. This is insane. Because most of us are rational and sane, and most of us have some moral breakers that keep us from going beyond the boundaries. But history has shown that in every age and in every continent and in every culture and in every religion, there are those for whom those breakers do not exist, for whom those limits don't exist. So, you know, the international community makes a huge mistake if they think that this can be handled exclusively regionally. And as you said, those in the region who are on the front lines are terrified that they will be left to deal with this alone. That would be their worst nightmare, would be for us to say, oh, you know, we don't want to interfere. This is a terrible matter, but, you know, you need to deal with these criminals, and it would only complicate things if we get involved. I agree, boots on the ground are not the only answer by any means, but they desperately need those with the capacity, with the wealth, with the means, with the resources to confront this, to weigh in heavily, not to stand on the sidelines, not to throw the occasional lifeline, but to be all in. And, you know, Paris happened, Copenhagen happened. They will not be the last. This is a global challenge. And the United States in particular, still as a, you know, first among equals to some extent in terms of capacity in the world, needs to be all in.
Next question. Yes, sir.
Hi, Matthew Hager from Catholic News Agency. Your Grace, you had talked earlier about the ability of anybody nowadays to be a reporter through social media, through being able to post videos online. Could you talk a little bit more about kind of the perils and pitfalls or some things that everyone needs to kind of watch out for in talking about what's going on over in the Middle East? You had said that reporting can affect lives. Lives can be at stake. You know, through people's abilities to post videos, use social media. Could you talk a little bit more about that specifically?
Terrorist organizations, even in their name, thrive on creating even only a concept or interpretation of terror and terrorizing people. So the more space they are given in social media, in traditional media, that's exactly what they want. I would like to see, and I don't know how, we speak about freedom of choice, we speak about freedom of speech, we speak about freedom of expression. I would like to see government authorities attack the legality of posting and propagating videos such as the ones that are put up and just being left. At law, and please correct me if I'm wrong, if a video on a CD that threatened directly was put through your letterbox into your home, that would be a direct threat and therefore illegal. Mm-hmm. And so posting this on the web as a global threat to every human being who doesn't see eye to eye with a particular group must be criminal. And so therefore must be under some sort of legislation so that it is taken out. Our children are on the internet all the time. Our children see these things. The first thing I thought after how sad this was about these poor young men was how polished and refined and choreographed the video that went out was. It was intentional. It was a public relations gimmick, except rather than using items, objects, they objectified and dehumanized people and used them as pawns in this video. And there needs to be a responsibility within people who spread these videos and spread this media and circulate it and think, oh, this is horrific. Well, if you think it's horrific, don't share it. Don't share it. There must be a way of reporting it. There must be somehow of controlling it. There must be somehow to control hate speech. I think if someone had created a similar video that pinpointed and focused on gender issue or a gender group, they would be taken to task. But the fact that it is targeting Christians, oh, it's just, that's happening again. And we've become very desensitized to it. So I would hope that there would be some steps to contain the internet, to contain the web, because of radicalization through the web, incitement through the web, propagation of these messages through the web. That is important. And I ask, especially young people, and within Middle Eastern community, even older people now who are on Facebook and social networks so much and share things so much, to be very selective about what they share, because realistically you are only playing exactly to their demands and doing their job for them.
Okay, I think that's going to wrap it up. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you for those great questions. And if you want to stay after and chit-chat a bit, we'd more than love to talk to you. Thank you.
May I just say one
Oh, sure. Your Grace? Go ahead.
One thing quickly, anyone here who would like, we have media packs ready with Miriam. Miriam, hand please. If you're interested in taking one that has a broad section of everything we've done, please feel free to take one from Miriam. Thank you.
Thank you all.